Over the course of its opening weekend, it became increasingly clear that Marvel's Eternals would come in well below initial box office projections. In the end, it was beaten by both Shang-Chi, Venom Let There Be Carnage, and Black Widow, which opened day and date on Disney+, no less. Adding insult to injury, the Rotten Tomatoes critic score continued to plummet down into the 40s, deep down in rotten territory. That's an MCU first, and given how it ticks all the diversity and inclusion boxes that critics value, something that no one saw coming. The reception to the Eternals is such that Deadline Hollywood labeled it a wake-up call for the MCU, and as we shall see, that is pretty astounding. To keep things rounded though, I will begin this editorial by going through the entertainment media's defense of the movie, before diving into why Kevin Feige indeed should treat this as a wake-up call, and what repercussions may come from this. As the Rotten Tomatoes score suggests, professional critics have been extremely harsh in their verdict of the Eternals, rating it far below both Thor: The Dark World and Iron Man 3. If one were to assess based on Rotten Tomatoes alone, it might even appear as though the critics are being harsher than the audience, who seem to rate the movie higher at Rotten Tomatoes at any rate. The reason I stress hedging terms like appear as though and seem to rate higher is that in the case of theatrical exclusives such as this, CinemaScore is the far more reliable measure of how the actual movie-going audience rates the movie. The reason for that is that the CinemaScore is determined by de facto exit polls of people leaving the theater. Therefore, it's less vulnerable to review bombing, whether it be negative or positive, because fake positive reviews are also a thing. Be that as it may, what kind of CinemaScore did the actual movie-going audience who just walked out of the theater give the Eternals? Well, this kind. The lowest CinemaScore of any MCU movie ever. So contrary to what Rotten Tomatoes at first glance might appear to suggest, both critics and moviegoers on the whole agree that Eternals is the worst feature film of the entire MCU to date. That has some people upset, which causes them to embarrass themselves trying to spin this. And embarrass themselves is exactly what the host of Variety's The Take did in defending the movie.
The newest one in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Eternals, from director and co-writer Chloe Zhao, actually drawing the lowest rated Rotten Tomatoes score of any MCU film in history thus far. First of all, Elizabeth, it is not a bad movie in the slightest. I think it's one of Marvel's best efforts thus far. Has great action, it focuses a lot on story, it's diverse, it has great characters, all that. I think this speaks to a larger problem that is in the industry. Anytime a woman takes on the action genre, which has been typically made for men to helm, people come harder on that filmmaker when she takes it on. I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed because it does not draw that criticism that it's been receiving.
I agree with you 100%. Right when you started talking about this, I said, imagine that. The film that is directed by a woman has the lowest score on Rotten Tomatoes. Not warranted.
So are we suggesting that if it was the exact same movie, but it had been directed by a man instead, everything would have been awesome? Are we suggesting that fans of Jack Kirby who are up in arms about this movie disrespecting his work would have been like, screw that guy, he's dead anyway, if this movie had only been directed by a man? Because that is patently ridiculous, and everyone old enough to remember Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman knows it. That being said, there are times when such questions might not be entirely without merit. For instance, would Nomadland have won the Oscar for Best Director if instead of Chloe Zhao, it had been directed by a white male? Perhaps, I don't know. However, I do suspect that if all else had been equal, except it being directed by a man, the response to the Eternals would have been pretty much exactly the same. Which is no doubt why even Deadline Hollywood called the Eternals a wake-up call for the MCU. Of all the trade and industry publications, Deadline Hollywood may be the most pro-Marvel and pro-Kevin Feige of all. During that whole Scarlett Johansson lawsuit debacle, few publications were more pro-Scarlett, pro-Marvel, and by implication, pro-Feige than Deadline Hollywood. Similarly, their coverage of Bob Chapek's Disney takeover has been quite negatively slanted. For more details on that, check out our recent Indiana Jones video, which also explores the origins of the feud between Marvel's Kevin Feige and Disney's Bob Chapek. The point I'm making here is that under normal circumstances, you'd expect Deadline Hollywood to put the best spin possible on Eternal's lackluster opening weekend. But they didn't. Instead, they admitted the box office was low and said, "Why, this is a wake-up call for the MCU." The piece in question read, "Now, before some sector of the Wall Street media writes about cinema's obituary or tries to blame the coof, let's provide a wake-up call here. It's not a shocker to see the numbers so low on Eternals, and it boils down to the film itself, not the current state of moviegoing. And you can't blame Disney in any way, shape or form for not selling Eternals, as its marketing machine was in great shape." In other words, Deadline Hollywood just made it abundantly clear that there was nothing wrong with either the marketplace or the marketing, so there's no point in trying to shift blame there. The movie itself simply wasn't good enough. And they don't pull any punches here. Oscar winner Chloe Zhao delivered a very Byzantine, confusing movie with 10 protagonists. Take note of that word, Byzantine. I'll get back to why that matters before long. That's part of the deeper universe Marvel IP, which is always a box office gamble. But Marvel has typically bucked such risks in the past. After pointing out just how bad the reception is, the writer of the piece points out that, "Personally, after seeing Eternals, I couldn't even tell you what it's about. They lure you in thinking one of the characters is a villain, and then they're not, and at the end of the day, the payoff isn't as seamless as learning who was Kaiser Soze at the end of The Usual Suspects. Between reviews and audience exits, these are not the type of results we're used to from Marvel, which typically yields platinum in both areas. From what we know about their sausage-making machine of test screenings with previous MCU filmmakers, and the Feige touch, there's usually safeguards in place to prevent such complications from ensuing. It's not clear what went sideways here. If I may interject though, between the lines, the way this whole piece is framed and worded, the implication is that the Feige touch is either missing or compromised. In either event, the implication is that Kevin Feige no longer has that Midas touch. The MCU has a great reputation for catapulting indie filmmakers with a unique voice, i.e. Taika Waititi, John Watts, etc., and harnessing them to display their visions within the parameters of the comic book environment. While Marvel, of course, had told ensemble stories before with the Avengers franchise and Captain America Civil War, quite often many of the characters were already set up in previous standalone films. That wasn't the case here in Eternals, and we've learned on Deadline's Hero Nation that there originally were 12 main characters mocked out on paper before Marvel scaled back to 10. Note the implication here. There were always too many characters, and they didn't scale back enough. Deadline Hollywood then concludes, "Perhaps Eternals would have been best served as a Disney Plus series. Any way you cut it, I'm sure Eternals is a lesson learned by Marvel." What they mean by that is that Eternals is a lesson in what not to do. Deadline Hollywood, traditionally one of Marvel's biggest supporters, just delivered a black eye to Kevin Feige. Well, to be fair, the reception of the movie did that. But what Deadline Hollywood did was strip away any and all excuse Marvel could hide behind. The movie itself simply isn't good enough, and worse yet, it did beginners' mistakes that Marvel should not be doing. They perfected the formula on how to do movies like this before, but with the Eternals, they appear to have forgotten the rulebook they themselves wrote. When Disney, over the next few days, will do a post-mortem on what went wrong here, and you can rest assured they will. This Deadline Hollywood piece, combined with the Forbes article we covered in our previous video, will make that post-mortem really uncomfortable for Marvel and Kevin Feige. As both a lead industry trade and a lead financial paper have already pointed the finger squarely at them, eliminating any and all other excuses. Kevin Feige and his loyalists at Marvel better hope the Marvel and Sony co-production Spider-Man No Way Home works out, and that the next full Marvel movie, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, really fires on all cylinders. Otherwise, none of them might last too long in Bob Chapek's restructured Byzantine Disney empire. There's that word again. Remember how Deadline Hollywood described Eternals as a very Byzantine, confusing movie? That stood out to me for two reasons. One, it is not a term that is commonly used. I mean, it's not something you use in everyday conversation, and even when describing movies, that term is way down the list. Case in point, Deadline Hollywood publishes multiple lengthy articles every single day, but you can count the instances where they've used the term Byzantine all year on your fingers, and still have fingers to spare. The other reason the use of that particular term stood out to me, though, is that all of Hollywood will associate it with one person, namely Disney CEO Bob Chapek. Back in May, Variety put out a piece that we covered extensively at the time, in which they described just how much Bob Chapek was shaking things up in his takeover at Disney. More specifically, Chapek was stripping division heads like Kathleen Kennedy and Kevin Feige of power, and giving that power to merchandise and distribution, proxies for paying consumers. That ruffled some serious feathers, and agents and dealmakers who also would see their power and influence reduced noted that the new structure at Disney is Byzantine and more convoluted than necessary, adding an extra managerial layer into the process of getting projects made. That quote reverberated around Hollywood. Now granted, it could be a complete coincidence that Deadline Hollywood suddenly used that term to describe a movie that Kevin Feige produced. But in my experience, there comes a point when coincidences are no longer coincidental. Considering that a game of 4D chess is in progress behind the scenes, I am inclined to believe that what we are seeing here is part of that game being fought out in the trades, right before our eyes. Do you think there's a connection here? Let me know your thoughts on that and everything else Eternals in the comments.